Who tied her up this sloppily? A man scoffed, his voice sharp enough to cut through the sweltering heat of the room. Before we get started, be sure to subscribe to Hero Tales by Jacob so you never miss these fascinating tales of courage. And let us know in the comments where you're watching today. The air inside the shack felt thick and old, as if it had been sitting still for years before being disturbed by the chaos unfolding now. Lieutenant Avery Lockwood, bruised and bound to a metal chair, lifted her gaze just an inch, enough to see the shadows moving around her. The zip ties dug so deeply into her wrist that her fingers pulsed with a slow numbness, but she kept her breathing even, steady, disciplined. Dust drifted lazily from the ceiling beams every time one of the armed men stepped too close, their boots scraping against the concrete floor in circles meant to intimidate her. They called themselves Desert Viper, a cartel-born militia operating along the Arizona border, but Avery had met men like them before, loud, cruel, and convinced that fear could replace strategy. They carried AK variants slung low on their shoulders, magazines taped together with the kind of makeshift readiness used by fighters who believed luck mattered more than skill. They laughed, jeered, nudged one another as if the woman in the chair wasn't studying every detail they revealed. And she was. Avery let her gaze drop toward the cracked window behind the man leading them. If she shifted her head, even slightly, she could feel the warm brush of wind leaking through the gap in the frame. To her left was the only door, barrier soft enough to break through if she weren't zip-tied like a trophy on display. But the real information lay in their hands, in how their fingers twitched, how their triggers rested half-kissed by impatience. The leader stepped forward at last. Mason Rourke, a name whispered across multiple intelligence reports, a ghost in every border town rumor. He stalked around her in a slow, practiced rhythm. His grin carried the smugness of a man who loved the sound of his boots more than the truth. "You're a long way from wherever Washington sends people like you," he said, crouching so close she could smell the cologne struggling to mask his sweat. "Tell me, Doc, what's a medical volunteer doing snooping around shipments that aren't her business?" The mocking tone was familiar. They believed she was Dr. Avery Woods, a traveling volunteer assigned to a border relief program. That was the point. That was the cover. But Rourke leaned too close, his shadow cutting across her bruised cheek like a second skin. He tapped her chin with cold fingertips, lifting her face toward the flickering bulb above them. "Look at me when I talk to you." She did, and her expression didn't change. Quiet, controlled, as if she were assessing a patient instead of reading a captor. Inside her chest, her heartbeat slowed rather than quickened. A Navy SEAL learned to remain still, even when every nerve screamed to act. And here, in the stale air between Rourke's words, she felt something shift. Not fear, never fear. It was the anticipatory stillness before a storm breaks, before violence chooses a direction. Rourke's men kept pacing, their shoulders brushing against one another in careless arcs. Their weapons knocked against walls, against chairs, against their own legs. Sloppy, predictable. None of them noticed the slight tilt of Avery's head as she listened, not to them, but to the world beyond the walls. A 4-second interval between passing trucks. A sputtering generator outside. A distant echo of steps on gravel. Every piece of the environment was a tool if she lived long enough to use it. "You know," Rourke said, rising slowly, "most people start crying by now. Begging. Offering information they don't even have." He clasped his hands behind his back, tilting his head. "But you," he narrowed his eyes. "You sit there like you're waiting for something." A corner of her mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close enough for him to notice. He straightened suddenly, irritation breaking through the arrogance in his expression. "What are you smirking at, Doc?" Avery lifted her chin, letting her hair fall back enough for her eyes to meet his directly. The room quieted, the kind of hush that arrives not from respect, but from the collective realization that something had just shifted. "You want to know what I'm waiting for?" she said softly, her voice steady as steel. Her next breath was controlled, anchored deep in her diaphragm. "I'm waiting for you to realize I'm not a doctor." The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Rourke blinked, confusion flickering across his eyes before it hardened into anger. "Then what are you?" he snapped. Avery let the truth land with a calm so unnerving it made two of the men take an involuntary step back. "I'm the one you should have never brought into this room." The bulb above her buzzed. Someone's grip tightened on a rifle. And Rourke, finally, felt the first drop of fear. But before he could respond, the narrative shifted. One moment, she was a helpless volunteer. The next, the door slammed open in a surge of desert heat and tension. A guard stuck his head inside, shouting something in Spanish about a perimeter breach, about headlights cutting through the valley, about movement they couldn't identify. Rourke cursed, snapping commands, the atmosphere twisting into disarray. Men scrambled, weapons lifted, boots thudding urgently against concrete. Avery timed each movement, memorizing who turned away first, who panicked, who hesitated. She lowered her head again, her breathing slow. Not yet. Not yet. Chaos was building, just as she needed. Outside, the generator sputtered again, a sign that the power would flicker soon. And if the lights went out, even for a second, she knew exactly how many steps she needed, how much momentum to generate, and which man she'd take down first. Her wrists burned where the zip ties cut deeper, but the pain meant circulation. And circulation meant she still had a chance. For the first time since she'd been dragged into the room, Avery allowed herself a full breath. The storm was coming, and she was ready to move the moment it broke. The moment the lights flickered, Avery Lockwood knew the window she'd been waiting for had finally cracked open. It wasn't a full outage, just a shudder in the power, the bulb overhead dimming to a trembling orange. But it was enough to shift the men's focus, enough to make their eyes dart toward the door instead of toward her. Panic lived loudly in undisciplined men. Rourke barked orders she couldn't fully hear over the scrape of boots. His voice was a mix of fury and unease now, the fragile confidence wavering. The guards nearest the doorway stepped out, rifles angled upward as if the threat might fall from the ceiling itself. Avery lowered her head further, letting her hair shield her eyes as she tested the flex in her wrist restraints. The plastic burned against her skin, but she pulled anyway, slow, deliberate tension, the kind a seal learned to apply without visible strain. She felt the band give by a fraction of a millimeter. Not enough to break, but enough to encourage. Rourke stalked back toward her, fingers digging into his scalp as he raked a hand through his hair. "Someone followed you here," he muttered, as if speaking it aloud made the danger more manageable. "You're going to tell me who? Right now?" Avery didn't lift her eyes. "You're assuming they came for me." He stiffened. "What does that mean?" She finally looked up, her expression unreadable. "Maybe they came for you." The flare of anger that crossed his face came fast and clumsy. "You think this is some kind of game?" "No," she said softly. "But you do." Behind him, one of his men re-entered the room, breathless. "Boss, we saw movement near the ridge. Someone's watching us." "Could be border patrol, could be feds." "That's impossible," Rourke snapped. "We scrubbed the entire valley." Avery settled back in her chair, letting the zip tie dig deeper, feeling the heat of blood rushing back into her fingertips. She had no idea who was outside, maybe no one, but Rourke didn't know that. His paranoia did the work for her, cracking his composure like thin ice. "Check again," Rourke hissed. 3 men sprinted out the door. For left inside. Her eyes cataloged their positions, their weapons, the angles of their footing. The one leaning near the window had his AK lowered without realizing it. The man closest to her chair was 2 breaths away from stepping too close, and she needed only one. The other 2 had nervous hands. Bad sign for them. Good sign for her. The lights flickered again, this time longer. Rourke turned sharply toward the window, distracted a second too long. A seal needed less than one. Avery wrenched her wrists apart, with every ounce of force coiled in her shoulders. The plastic zip tie snapped with a sharp crack that sliced through the room. Before anyone could react, she drove her head forward, smashing her forehead into the chest of the nearest guard. The man stumbled back, air knocked from his lungs as he reached wildly for his rifle. Too slow. Avery seized his weapon, twisted it downward, and delivered a crushing blow to his knee. He collapsed with a scream. The second guard swung his rifle toward her, but she was already moving, sliding behind the first man's falling body, using him as partial cover. A burst of gunfire shredded the chair she had been strapped to seconds before. Avery surged forward, hands closing around the rifle barrel as she yanked it sideways. The guard lost his balance, stumbling toward her. She pivoted, slammed the butt of the weapon into his jaw, and watched him drop. 2 left. One raised his weapon, but she kicked the fallen guard's rifle across the floor. It skidded into the man's shins, tripping him long enough for her to cross the gap and drive her elbow into his throat. He collapsed, choking. Only Rourke remained. He had drawn a pistol, bigger, steadier, deadlier than the rifles his men carried. And unlike his men, he did not hesitate. But Avery didn't either. She kicked the table toward him. It toppled sideways with a clatter that mismatched the timing of his gunshot. The round tore into the wood instead of into her, splinters snapping across the room. She lunged. Rourke fired again, but she was already inside his reach, slamming her shoulder into him as she grabbed his wrist. They crashed against the wall, struggling for control of the weapon. He strained to push the barrel toward her, but his grip was slipping, sweat, panic, adrenaline twisting his movements into mistakes. "You think you're tough?" he snarled, spit flying. No, Avery's voice was cold, breath steady. "I think you're slow." She twisted his wrist sharply. Bone cracked. Rourke screamed. The gun clattered to the floor. Avery didn't hesitate. She drove her knee up into his gut, forcing the air from his lungs, then slammed her palm against his jaw. His head snapped sideways, and he crumpled to the ground, wheezing. She stepped back, forcing her breath to steady despite her pounding pulse. For a brief second, the room was silent except for the hum of the faulty generator. Then, a shadow passed across the window. Not Rourke's men. Someone else. Avery snatched the pistol off the floor and ducked behind the overturned table, aiming toward the door. Her thoughts raced. If this was backup, they would have breached already. If it wasn't backup, she tightened her grip. "Move," she whispered to herself, the word not fear but preparation. Footsteps neared. The door swung inward. Avery held her stance, and a familiar voice hissed, "Avery, it's Reyes. We need to go. Now." Her exhale came slow, tension bleeding from her shoulders just enough to stand. But only for a moment, because behind Reyes, down the hallway, she saw headlights, bright, sweeping, coming fast. "Are they following you?" she asked. Reyes grabbed her arm. "No time. They're circling the building." Avery looked toward the unconscious men scattered around her feet, toward Rourke, groaning on the floor, toward the faint red glow rising through the window as engines revved outside. She steadied the pistol. "Then we fight our way out," she said. The storm hadn't passed. It had only begun. The headlights outside swept across the thin wooden walls, spilling white streaks of light across the floor as Avery Lockwood moved toward the doorway with Reyes close behind. Dust trembled from the ceiling every time an engine revved, the ground vibrating beneath her boots as Desert Viper vehicles fanned out around the shack like wolves tightening their circle. Reyes tossed her a spare magazine. 2 trucks on the north ridge. Maybe 3 more behind them. They know someone breached the perimeter. Avery locked the magazine into the pistol with a sharp click. "So they're hunting." Reyes exhaled hard. "Yeah, and they're not subtle about it." She didn't bother responding. The tension in her muscles did the talking for her as she scanned the corridor ahead. The peeling paint, the cracked cement, the hallway narrowing into a single dark exit. They would have to break through fast or die in a bottleneck. Rourke's voice echoed behind them as he dragged himself upright, wheezing through the pain in his shattered wrist. "You won't make it out there," he spat. "They'll bury you in the dirt." Avery didn't look back. "Then they'd better move quickly." Reyes pointed toward the narrow staircase that led up to the roof hatch. "Extraction point is a 1/4 mile east. But if we head through the front, they'll cut us off." "Roof," Avery said. Reyes nodded. They sprinted toward the stairs, boots slamming against wood that creaked dangerously with each step. The walls rattled as the trucks outside repositioned, engines growling like beasts preparing to charge. Halfway up, gunfire erupted from the side of the shack, short, controlled bursts that punched holes in the siding. Splinters rained around them as the bullets carved through the staircase railing. "Go," Reyes shouted, pushing Avery ahead. She reached the hatch first. But the moment she shoved it open, 2 shots cracked over her head, ricocheting off the metal frame. She dropped low, pistol raised, eyes narrowing through the darkness. 2 silhouettes stood on the rooftop, Desert Viper scouts, rifles angled down, ready. Avery lunged upward, firing a clean double tap. 1 man fell instantly. The second fired back, bullets slicing the air inches from her head. She rolled, sprang up again, and delivered another precise shot. Silence returned to the rooftop, but only for a breath. Reyes climbed through beside her, squinting against the dry wind blowing across the desert. We need to move before. He didn't finish, because the sky suddenly lit up with the glow of oncoming headlights stretching across the valley. The vehicles pivoted in formation, 2 trucks breaking away and speeding toward the shack. They're trying to box us in, Avery said. Reyes looked left. Ridge trail drops down there. But it's open terrain. No cover. Avery turned right. What about the water trench? It's narrow, rocky, and filled with snakes. Better than bullets. They ran. Boots hammered against the concrete rooftop before they leapt onto the lower extension and dropped into the sand below. The ground hit hard, knocking the wind from their lungs, but they didn't stop. Avery adjusted her pace to the rise and fall of the uneven desert terrain, every step measured, every breath calculated. Behind them, the militia realized their prey had slipped the noose. Shouts burst through the night. Engines roared. The chase was on. Reyes pointed ahead. Trench is 50 yards. Avery didn't need the reminder. The groove carved into the earth was a faint, wavering shadow under the moonlight. They sprinted for it as trucks barreled across the field, dust clouds rising behind the tires like plumes from a charging herd. A burst of gunfire erupted. Bullets bit into the sand around their feet, snapping the air with terrifying precision. Down! Avery shouted. They dove into the trench just as a hail of rounds tore across the ground where they'd been standing. The world narrowed into a strip of cold, jagged shadow. Rocks scraped their arms as they crawled deeper. Above them, the headlights of the trucks swept past, and then returned, slower this time, like predators sniffing for movement. Reyes pressed his back to the dirt wall, struggling to breathe. We're pinned. Avery lifted her head just high enough to peek over the edge. Not yet. Across the valley, a faint glimmer caught her eye, dust kicking up in an unnatural pattern, a flicker of infrared reflection. She recognized it instantly. Helicopter lights. Her heart steadied. Extraction wasn't far, if they reached the rendezvous point. But reaching it meant crossing an open stretch of land fully exposed to Desert Viper rifles. Reyes followed her gaze. 2 minutes away. Maybe. That's all we need. They crawled along the trench, keeping low as the trucks repositioned. Avery could hear Rourke shouting orders over a radio, his voice breaking with desperation. She's not a doctor. She's military. Don't let her reach the ridge. Reyes smirked weakly. At least they figured it out. Too late, Avery said. The trench curved east, then opened abruptly into a small clearing illuminated by moonlight. The helicopter was still unseen, but its distant thrum had grown stronger. Wind pushed through the valley, carrying the promise of rotor wash. They climbed out. A beam of light suddenly snapped on. A spotlight. One of the trucks had found them. Run! Avery shouted. They sprinted, sand kicking up under their heels as the truck turned sharply, headlights blinding them. Gunfire erupted again, long streams that ripped across the terrain, shots landing so close Avery felt the impact vibrate through the ground. Reyes stumbled but kept running. The thrum of the helicopter grew louder. Closer. Angrier. Avery saw the silhouette of it breaking over the ridge, an MH-60, fast and descending quickly. They were almost there. A bullet grazed her shoulder, tearing fabric and scraping flesh. The pain was sharp but distant. She kept moving. Reyes yelled, 10 yards. The helicopter's searchlight locked onto them, bathing them in a brilliant cone of white. A crewman leaned out, waving them forward as the landing gear lowered. The truck behind them accelerated, engine screaming, closing the gap. Avery pushed Reyes up the ramp first. Then she turned, not away from the threat, toward it. She fired a full magazine into the truck's windshield, forcing it to veer sharply, tires digging into sand, the vehicle spinning sideways before flipping in a violent crash. The explosion erupted seconds later, fire leaping into the night sky. The crewman grabbed Avery's arm. Get in. She stepped backward onto the ramp as the helicopter lifted, sand whipping into the air in a wild storm. Below them, Rourke crawled out of the wreckage of the shack, staring up with a hatred so sharp it seemed to slice through the darkness. Avery watched him shrink into the distance until he became nothing but a speck in the desert. Reyes sat beside her, chest heaving. You good? Avery nodded slowly. For now. But her eyes hardened. Because escape was only the beginning. Something far bigger and far more dangerous waited beyond the border, and she could feel it closing in. The MH-60 carved through the night sky, its rotor blades pounding the air in a steady rhythm that matched Avery Lockwood's pulse. She sat with her back against the cabin wall, letting the vibration travel through her bones as the adrenaline slowly seeped out of her bloodstream. Reyes sat across from her, hunched slightly, his breathing still uneven from the sprint and the gunfire. The medic moved between them, assessing wounds with quiet efficiency, but Avery barely felt the sting of antiseptic. Her mind wasn't in the helicopter. It was back in the shack, back in the room where Rourke had stood with that smug confidence, unaware that he'd already lost the moment she was tied to the chair. Back in the desert, where makeshift vents poked out of the soil and reinforced doors disguised something dangerous, something far larger than the cartel could build alone. A chemical smell, a hum beneath the ground, barrels marked with hazard symbols. TX-13. She knew the code name. She knew the rumors. But hearing about something in a briefing room was different from watching terrified locals describe their burns, different from seeing the panic in Reyes's eyes when he realized what the shipment could mean. A biochem compound engineered for silent spread. 1 gram could poison a reservoir. 1 liter could contaminate an entire city block. And Rourke's men had been moving barrels. Not vials. Not samples. Barrels. Reyes broke the silence first. I thought we lost you back there. Avery looked up, her voice low. You almost did. The medic glanced between them. You're both lucky. If we were 2 minutes later, Avery didn't need him to finish. She already knew. She tightened the gauze wrapped around her shoulder. How long to base? 30 minutes. The crew chief replied over the engine noise. Hale wants you debriefed ASAP. Rear Admiral Jonathan Hale wasn't the kind of man who summoned operators unless the situation demanded immediate action. If he was waiting for them, something had escalated. She closed her eyes briefly, replaying the sequence of events. The trucks burrowing underground, the reinforced barn, the convoy route. It wasn't random smuggling. It wasn't opportunistic crime. It was infrastructure. Infrastructure meant planning. And planning meant a bigger hand behind Desert Viper. When the helicopter finally touched down at the Desert Forward operating camp, the downdraft kicked sand into spirals around them. Avery stepped into the light of the landing pad, blinking through the grit as teams rushed equipment into tents lit by harsh flood lamps. Hale was already striding toward her. His uniform wasn't crisp the way it usually was. His sleeves were pushed up, his collar undone slightly, his jaw clenched tight. Small tells that the situation had deteriorated faster than command could stabilize. Behind him, Lieutenant Colonel Porter kept pace, tablet in hand, his expression tense. Avery, Hale said, not bothering with formalities. Inside. Now. She followed them into the main briefing tent. The moment the flap closed behind her, the noise of the flight line fell away, replaced by the soft hum of computers and the frantic tapping of analysts working at long portable tables. Maps illuminated the monitors, red lines forming routes across the Arizona sector, branching toward Phoenix, Tucson, and 3 smaller border towns she recognized by reputation alone. Reyes sat on a medical cot nearby, bandaged but alert. Hale turned to Avery. Tell me everything from the moment you entered the town. Avery recounted the events with precision, meeting the locals, noting the trucks, the strange silence in the marketplace, the barrels, the underground ramp, the ambush, the capture. She spoke evenly, never raising her voice, never embellishing. When she finished, Porter exhaled hard. We intercepted chatter 30 minutes ago. Rourke reported a breach, but didn't know your identity. He assumed you were a federal contractor. He'll know the truth soon enough, Avery said. Hale tapped a satellite image on the screen. The site you scouted wasn't just a storage facility. It's part of a chain, 5 locations across the region. For confirmed, 1 still unknown. Avery studied the pattern. The distribution model is too coordinated. Rourke doesn't have this kind of reach. Hale nodded. Exactly. Someone higher is feeding him money, intel, and structure. Porter added, during the last hour, the analysts decrypted fragments from a flash drive taken off another Viper lieutenant last week. There were coded messages, coordinates, access codes, all routed through federal channels. Avery stilled. She knew where this was going. Reyes finally spoke, voice rough but steady. It's someone inside the command chain. Someone with clearance. Porter tapped again, and a photo appeared on the screen. A woman in uniform. Calm smile. Confident posture. Familiar eyes. Captain Melissa Rain. Avery felt a cold thud in her chest. Not shock, not denial. Recognition. Rain had been the one who briefed her before the mission. Rain had delivered the cover identity. Rain had emphasized the urgency of tracking TX-13, yet had withheld key intel on distribution routes. It all fell into place like dominoes toppling in slow motion. Hale's voice softened, but only slightly. We're still confirming. But the evidence is building fast. Avery stepped closer to the screen, studying Rain's photo. If she's embedded this deep, she won't run. She'll finish what she started. Reyes leaned forward on the cot. She planned your insertion. She could have been setting you up from the beginning. Avery didn't deny it. She felt it in her gut. Hale's voice cut through the silence. Avery, we're assigning you to lead the recovery of TX-13. You know the terrain, you've seen the operation firsthand, and if Rain anticipates anything, she'll anticipate me. Avery finished. Hale met her eyes. Exactly. Avery straightened, her posture sharpening into something controlled and resolute. Then I need everything you have on Rain. Personnel logs, duty rosters, recent travel patterns, encrypted calls, the whole chain. Porter nodded, already pulling up files. We've flagged her last known location. A federal facility outside Yuma. Access restricted, minimal oversight. Avery felt the air shift. Yuma was a secure zone. If Rain was there, she wasn't hiding. She was preparing. Reyes stood, wincing slightly. I'm going with her. Hale shook his head. You're not cleared for field duty. Reyes glanced at Avery. I wasn't cleared for tonight either. Still happened. Avery allowed the closest thing to approval, a slight nod. We moved together. Hale sighed. But he didn't argue. Fine. But you leave in 1 hour. Avery's pulse steadied. Her mind sharpened. The path ahead crystallized. Rourke had been a symptom. Rain was the architect. And TX-13 was still moving. Avery turned toward the entrance of the tent, the night wind slipping in just enough to carry the scent of desert dust across her face. This time, there was no flicker of fear. Only focus. Only purpose. Only the quiet certainty that she was moving toward the heart of something far deadlier than anything she'd faced before. The storm hadn't passed. It was preparing to break. The night outside the forward operating camp was colder than the desert usually allowed, as if the land itself sensed what was coming. Avery Lockwood stepped into the open air with her gear strapped tight, her movements precise, economical. The stars hung sharp above the horizon, scattered like shards of glass across the black sky. She inhaled deeply, letting the crisp wind clear the last remnants of sand from her lungs. 1 hour. That was all the time Rear Admiral Hale had given her to prepare. Now the hour was up. Reyes walked beside her, leaning slightly on his good leg, but determined, jaw set in that stubborn line she'd grown accustomed to. He had insisted on joining her despite the medical officer's protests. Avery had simply said he comes. And that had been the end of the discussion. A convoy waited at the far edge of the camp. 3 armored SUVs, engines idling in the darkness. The headlights were off to avoid detection, but the silhouettes of operators were visible inside. Porter met them halfway, handing Avery a secured tablet. This is everything we have on Rain's movements in the last 72 hours, he said. The federal facility outside Yuma logs her entry at 2100 last night. No exit recorded. Avery's grip tightened. She's still there. Or she wants you to think she is, Porter replied. Rain is calculated. She plans 10 steps ahead. Whatever TX-13 is meant for, the facility is part of it. Reyes glanced at the convoy. Security? High, Porter said. But not high enough to stop the wrong person, assuming that person has high-level clearance. Avery didn't need to say Rain's name. No one did. Hale approached them next, expression heavy but resolute. Lockwood, this is a containment mission. Quiet entry. Quiet exit. No collateral damage. No media. And if Rain is inside, he paused. The unspoken words hung in the air. Avery finished them. I handle it. Hale nodded once, the gesture slow, reluctant. She was one of ours. Remember that. She made her choice, Avery replied. She stepped toward the lead vehicle. Reyes followed, bracing one hand on the door frame as he climbed inside. Avery slid into the passenger seat, the driver giving her a silent nod before shifting into gear. As the convoy rolled out, the camp behind them dimmed into the distance, the floodlights shrinking into pale stars swallowed by desert darkness. The road ahead stretched endlessly, an unbroken ribbon of asphalt cutting through the barren landscape. Reyes broke the silence after several minutes. You trained under rain, didn't you? Avery watched the empty horizon. She evaluated my BUD/S performance. Oversaw 2 of my field tests. She was disciplined, steady, calm. The kind of officer who never let emotion interfere. Reyes exhaled. So what happened? I don't know, Avery said, and she hated how true that was. The convoy pushed deeper into the night. When they reached the outskirts of the Yuma facility, the air changed. The perimeter was cloaked in unnatural quiet, the usual hum of activity eerily absent. Too absent. The SUVs parked half a mile out. Operators moved ahead on foot, weapons low, steps controlled. Avery and Reyes followed, cutting through the sparse brush until the exterior fence rose before them. Tall, razor-lined, unforgiving. Porter's voice whispered through their earpieces. Thermal shows minimal movement inside. Something's wrong. Avery focused on the eastern gate. Rain disabled the rotations. Can she do that remotely? Reyes asked. If she had clearance, Avery said. And she did. They slipped through the cut section of the fence left deliberately open. Another sign that the breach wasn't an accident. It was an invitation. The facility loomed ahead. Concrete walls, narrow windows, red lights blinking lazily atop communication towers. Avery's boots made no sound on the packed dirt as she approached the main service corridor door. It was unlocked. Another invitation, Reyes murmured. Or a trap, Avery replied. Inside, the lights flickered intermittently like weak pulses. The hallways smelled of metal, dust, and something faintly chemical. They moved carefully, clearing each corner, Reyes's breathing quiet but uneven. When they reached the inner security wing, Avery paused. The armored case holding TX-13 sat in the center of the room, unattended. A single red light blinked on the latch, armed but not activated. And standing just 10 feet away, facing the case with her hands clasped calmly behind her back, was Captain Melissa Rain. She didn't turn as Avery entered. Her voice echoed softly in the chamber. You were always too perceptive for your own good, Avery. Avery raised her pistol. Step away from the case. Rain finally faced her. Her expression wasn't wild or frantic. It was composed, almost serene. You think I'm trying to harm this country? Reyes aimed beside Avery. You moved hazardous materials through civilian zones. You used locals as unwitting couriers. People were burned. Some died. Rain's eyes darkened. Collateral. Necessary. Controlled testing prevented larger casualties. Testing for what? Avery demanded. Rain stepped closer, not threateningly, but with the calm of someone trying to explain a complicated truth to a stubborn student. The system is broken, Avery. You've seen it. Border intel collapses every year. Funding is swallowed by committees. Threats slip through constantly. I found a solution. A permanent deterrent. Avery's jaw tightened. You were going to deploy TX-13. Not deploy, Rain corrected. Demonstrate. Enough to force change. Enough to show the cracks so they can't hide them anymore. Reyes shook his head, disbelief twisting his features. You were willing to kill thousands. Rain's voice softened. A controlled catastrophe. One that saves millions long term. Avery stepped forward, rage steady and cold. You became the threat you swore to stop. Rain sighed. A quiet, almost mournful sound. I hoped you wouldn't show up tonight. You were the only variable I couldn't predict. You underestimated me, Avery said. Rain gave a faint, sad smile. I overestimated the system. Her hand dropped toward the case. Avery moved instantly. The shot cracked through the room, sharp, echoing against metal walls. Rain staggered backward, collapsing beside the armored case, the red light on its latch still blinking but untouched. Avery knelt beside her, checking her pulse. It was fading. Rain's voice was barely a whisper. I wanted to fix it. Avery's reply was quiet, steady, unshaken. Then you should have fought from the right side. Rain's eyes closed, breath slipping away. Operators burst into the room moments later, sweeping the area, securing the case, assessing every inch of the facility. Backup teams hauled in equipment to deactivate any remaining devices. The crisis faded into controlled calm. Avery stood apart from the chaos, watching silently as TX-13 was locked into a containment vehicle. Reyes approached her, exhaustion written across his face. "You did what had to be done," he said. Avery didn't answer. Her gaze drifted to the case as it was carried away, the silent reminder of a catastrophe that almost happened, engineered by someone she once trusted. Hours later, when she stepped out into the pale glow of early morning, the wind felt gentler, softer. The world looked ordinary again. Facility workers resetting checkpoints, vehicles rolling out, paperwork being filed that would never mention her name. Reyes waited near the transport plane's ramp. "Ready?" Avery looked toward the rising sun, its golden light washing over her bruised hands and tired eyes. "Yeah," she said quietly. "Let's go home." She walked up the ramp, pausing only once to breathe in the cool morning air. True courage didn't crave recognition. It lived in silence, in the unseen choices, in the narrow escapes, in the burdens carried for a world that would never know. And Avery Lockwood stepped into that silence willingly, ready for whatever waited beyond the next horizon.